When people discuss the greatest pitcher of all time, you'll hear a lot of different answers. Every era is different and hard to compare, so I'm going to go over who I believe to be the best pitcher of each decade. There's no one right answer for any of these, as a lot have a couple of pitchers you can argue, so don't take my word as the definitive answer, this is just my opinion. With that being said, let's start with the 1870s. The 1870s were baseball's first real decade, and nobody defined it more than Albert Spalding. Playing for the Boston Red Sox, Spalding wasn't just the ace, he was essentially the entire pitching staff. Between 1871 and 1877, he won 251 games, leading Boston to 4 straight championships in the Old National Association. His ERA across the decade sat around 2.13, and he threw more than 2,800 innings, usually finishing what he started. Spalding wasn't flashy, but his dominance and leadership set the standard for what an ace looked like. He was calm, reliable, and always gave his team a chance to win. In an era where chaos was everywhere, barehanded fielders, experimental rules, and short-lived franchises, Spalding was stability. Now, Tommy Bond deserves a huge mention here. In 1877, he became arguably the first pitcher to ever win the pitching Triple Crown, leading the league in wins, ERA, and strikeouts. He probably had the best peak year of the decade. Then there was also Candy Cummings, who was credited with inventing the curveball and changed pitching forever with this innovation. Jim Devlin looked like he could have rivaled Spalding, throwing every inning for Louisville in 1877 before being banned for life in the game's first gambling scandal. But why Spalding over Bond? Bond had the higher single-season peak, but Spalding's sustained dominance in championships across the entire decade made him the face of 1870s pitching. He defined the role, anchored the first baseball dynasty, and later shaped the game itself when he founded the Spalding Sporting Goods Company. The 1870s belonged to Al Spalding. The 1880s were a turning point for pitching. In '84, overhand deliveries were finally legalized, and pitchers suddenly had a new weapon. Velocity and movement that hitters had never seen before. No one took advantage of this better than John Clarkson. Across the decade, Clarkson won over 220 games with a 2.54 ERA and an ERA plus of 141, all while throwing nearly 2,900 innings. He had nearly 17 more in his 1889 season with video game numbers, and that was not a fluke. Clarkson led his team, the Chicago White Stockings, and later the Boston Beaneaters, to multiple pennants, and established himself as one of the best of his time. Now, the 1880s also gave us some of the most iconic pitching stories in history. Aldhouse Radburn's 1884 season, 59 wins and 3 straight victories in the championship series, is perhaps the single greatest season any pitcher has ever had. Tim Keefe was a model of consistency, finishing the decade with an ERA around 2.6 in multiple 41 seasons. And then there was Pud Galvin, the first pitcher to reach 300 wins and threw almost 5,000 innings in this decade, becoming the ultimate Iron Man. So why Clarkson over Radburn? It's the difference between one historic peak versus a full decade of dominance. Radbourn had 1884, but Clarkson owned the entire decade, adapting to new rules, carrying dynasties, and posting elite numbers year after year. You could definitely argue for Radbourn, but I'm just going to go with Clarkson here. The 1890s were brutal on pitchers. In 1893, the mound was pushed back to 60 feet 6 inches, the same distance used today. Offense skyrocketed, ERAs ballooned, and many pitchers never adjusted. But Kid Nichols thrived, and that's why he's the pitcher of the 1890s. He won an incredible 298 games in the 1890s with a 2.97 ERA, an ERA plus of 146, and more than 3,900 innings pitched. He won 30 or more games 7 different times and led the Boston Beaneaters to 5 pennants. He had over 100 more in this decade as well. The competition was fierce. Cy Young was already building his legendary career, winning well over 200 games in the 1890s alone, and showing the adaptability that would keep him great into the 1900s. Amos Ruzi, the Hoosier Thunderbolt, terrified hitters with his blazing fastball, and his wildness was part of the reason the mound was moved back in 1893. He still managed to lead the league in strikeouts a few times, and Clark Griffith, while less dominant, was one of the most respected pitchers and later became a Hall of Fame manager and owner. So why Nichols over Cy Young? It's close. Cy Young's name is baseball immortality, and his 1890s numbers are jaw-dropping, but Nichols had the edge in dominance within the decade itself. He won more games, had a slightly better ERA plus, and was the ace of a dynasty. While Cy Young spread his greatness across 3 decades, Nichols' 1890 run was concentrated dominance. That's why I'm giving the 1890s to Kid Nichols. The 1900s were the heart of the Deadball Era. Time when home runs were rare, games were scrappy, and pitchers ruled the sport, and no pitcher embodied that more than Christy Mathewson of the New York Giants. From 1900 to 1909, Mathewson posted a 1.98 ERA, an ERA plus of 143, and threw almost 3,000 innings. He won 236 games this decade, including 4 31 seasons. What made him special wasn't just the numbers though, it was the way he pitched. Nicknamed the Christian Gentleman, Mathewson brought a level of polish and intelligence to pitching that was rare for the time. His famous fadeaway pitch, essentially a screwball, baffled hitters throughout the decade. Mathewson's crowning moment came in the 1905 World Series when he threw 3 complete game shutouts in 6 days to lead the Giants to a championship. No pitcher before or since has ever dominated a World Series like that. He wasn't just great during the regular season, he was legendary when it mattered most. Of course, the 1900s also featured some incredible competition. Ed Walsh of the White Sox posted a ridiculous sub-2 ERA across the decade and threw over 460 innings in 1908 alone during one of the greatest pitching seasons ever. Addie Joss was untouchable when healthy, posting an ERA under 2 and tossing one of the earliest perfect games in 1908. And then there was also Rube Waddell, eccentric and unpredictable. He led the league in strikeouts 6 straight years while becoming one of baseball's first true characters. But Mathewson stood above them all because he had it all. The numbers, the durability, the postseason legacy, and the grace under pressure. While Walsh and Joss had otherworldly peaks, and Waddell had the strikeouts, Mathewson was the pitcher everyone else in the 1900s measured themselves against. 1910s, Walter Johnson. If the 1900s belonged to Mathewson, the 1910s were all about one man, Walter Johnson. Also known as the Big Train, he wasn't just the best pitcher of the decade, he was arguably the most dominant pitcher baseball has ever seen. Pitching for the Washington Senators, Johnson was just almost unfair. From 1910 to 1919, he won 265 games, posted a 1.59 ERA, and had an ERA plus of 183. That meant he was close to double as good as the average pitcher. He struck out over 2,000 hitters in the decade, led the AL in strikeouts 8 straight years, and had seasons where his ERA sat under 1.5 despite throwing 300 innings. His combination of velocity and command was something the game had never seen before, and Johnson wasn't just compiling stats. He had legendary moments. In 1913, he won 36 games with a 1.14 ERA. It truly was one of the greatest pitching seasons in history. Despite playing for a Senators team that was usually mediocre, Johnson's sheer brilliance made him the face of pitching in the 1910s. But he wasn't alone. Grover Cleveland Alexander was right there with him, winning over 1,200 games in the 1910s, including 3 consecutive 30-WAR seasons from 1915 to 17. His 2 ERA and 96 WAR in the decade are astonishing, and many argue he was the equal of Johnson. Smokey Joe Wood had one of the best single seasons ever in 1912, going 34-5 with a 1.91 ERA, and then winning 3 games in the World Series. And of course, a young Babe Ruth was still primarily a pitcher for Boston, throwing a 2.19 ERA over 1,200 innings before becoming the greatest slugger the game had ever seen. What made Johnson stand out wasn't just that he was great, it was that he was consistently great across the entire decade. Alexander had the wins, Wood had the peak, Ruth was great as well in a smaller sample size, but Johnson's decade-long mastery, despite pitching for teams that rarely gave him much support, made him untouchable. He was the Big Train, and in the 1910s, I don't think anyone else came close. The 1920s were the beginning of the live ball era, when Babe Ruth started smashing home runs, offense was exploding, and pitchers who had dominated in the dead ball days suddenly saw their ERAs rise. But amidst all that hitting chaos, one pitcher carved out his own legacy. Dazzy Vance of the Brooklyn Robins. Vance didn't even break into the majors full-time until he was 31, but once he did, he owned the decade. From 1922 through 1929, he led the National League in strikeouts 7 straight years. Across the 1920s, he posted a 3.1 ERA, an ERA plus of 130, over 1,500 Ks, and a little over 50 B-WAR. In 1924, he put it all together, winning the MVP after going 28-6 with a 2.16 ERA and 262 strikeouts. Total that was unheard of in that offensive-heavy era. What made Vance stand out was how different he looked compared to everyone else. He was a true power pitcher in a time when most pitchers relied on finesse. His fastball and sharp-breaking curve baffled hitters, and while the ball was flying out of ballparks at record rates, Vance was striking out hitters like it was a different sport. He wasn't the only great arm of the decade. Lefty Grove burst onto the scene in 1925, and in just 5 seasons put up an ERA plus of 147 and a WAR total of 62. Setting himself up to dominate the 1930s. Stan Kovaleski gave Cleveland its first title in 1920, famously winning 3 complete games in the World Series with a .67 ERA. And Urban Shocker was a durable and effective workhorse who won over 20 games 4 times during the decade, and also just had an elite baseball name. But while Grove might have been the better pitcher overall, his peak came later. The 1920s were the decade where Dazzy Vance was untouchable, carving out his own dominance in the heart of the live ball explosion. 1930s, Lefty Grove. The previously mentioned Lefty Grove, who was arguably the best pitcher of the 1920s depending on who you ask, was I think the best pitcher of the 1930s. By now, offense was still booming. Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, and Mel Ott were terrorizing pitchers, but Grove managed to shine brighter than probably any other pitcher at the time. In the 1930s, Grove posted a 2.91 ERA, an ERA plus of 162, and nearly 2,400 innings pitched, good for about an 80.7 WAR in the decade. He won 7 ERA titles, led the league in strikeouts multiple times, and from 1921 to 1931, yeah, I'm not counting 1929 for why he's the best pitcher, but I still want to talk about it. He put together a 3-year run where he went 79-15, including a 31-4 season in 1931 that earned him the AL MVP. No pitcher in the hitter-friendly 1930s dominated quite like him. And Grove wasn't just a regular season ace, he was a cornerstone of Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's dynasty, helping them win 3 straight pennants from 29 to 31, and back-to-back World Series in 29 and 30. Again, I'm not counting these stats towards the 1930s, but I'm just saying it for context. In those fall classics, Grove went 4-2 with a 1.75 ERA, proving that even in October, he was nearly unhittable. His biggest challenger in the 30s was Carl Hubbell of the New York Giants, who was almost as dominant. Hubbell won 2 MVPs, threw a screwball that tied hitters in knots, and famously struck out Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, and Joe Cronin in succession during the 1934 All-Star Game. The most iconic pitching feats ever. Dizzy Dean also left his mark with the Cardinals. In 1934, he won 30 games, something no National League pitcher has done since, and led St. Louis to a World Series title. And Red Ruffing, while not as dominant individually, became the Yankees' October ace, winning 7 World Series games in the 30s alone. But the 30s were Grove's era. He combined the volume of Ruffing, the peak seasons of Dean, and the sustained dominance of Hubbell. In a decade where hitters ruled, Grove still stood tall as the most dominant pitcher in the game. The 1940s were one of the most complicated decades in baseball history. World War II dramatically changed the landscape, with countless stars leaving the game to serve, and none more famously than Bob Feller. Feller debuted in 1936 as a 17-year-old flamethrower, and by the time the 40s began, he was already the most electrifying pitcher in baseball. In 1940, he led the league in wins with 27, innings pitched at 320, and strikeouts at over 260, while posting a 2.61 ERA. He followed that up in 1941 by striking out 260 batters again and winning 25 games, and he was only 22 years old. Then came Pearl Harbor. Feller was the very first MLB player to enlist after the attack, joining the Navy the next day. He lost almost 4 full seasons of his prime from 1942 through 1945, serving as a gunner on the USS Alabama. When he returned in 1946, it was as if he never left. He threw 36 complete games in one season, finished with 26 wins, and struck out 348 batters, a total that wouldn't be matched until Sandy Koufax 2 decades later. Across the 1940s, even with the lost years, Feller put up a 2.9 ERA and an ERA plus of 131, and about 900 innings. He also had nearly 40 WAR. His fastball was legendary. Stories say it was once clocked at 98.6 miles per hour using a Harley-Davidson motorcycle as a speed comparison test. In an era of reduced offense and war-shortened rosters, Feller's dominance stood out even more. Other great arms left their mark too. Hal Newhouser, who I actually covered in another video, won back-to-back AL MVPs in 1944 and 45, and that's something no pitcher has ever done. He also carried the Tigers to a World Series in 45. Spud Chandler had a brilliant 1943 season with the Yankees winning MVP and having a 1.64 ERA, and a young Warren Spahn debuted in 1942 before serving 3 years in the Army, setting himself up to become the defining pitcher of the 50s. But the 1940s belonged to Bob Feller. Even with 4 years gone, his sheer dominance before and after the war, combined with his cultural importance as a war hero, made him the pitcher everyone remembers from this decade. 1950s, Warren Spahn. If Feller was the fireballing prodigy of the 40s, then Warren Spahn was the model of consistency in the 50s. Pitching for the Boston and then later Milwaukee Braves, Spahn became the definition of a durable ace year after year, inning after inning. From 1950 to 1959, Spahn won 202 games, posted a 2.92 ERA, an ERA plus of 126, and threw over 2,800 innings. He was a 20-game winner 7 times in the decade, made the All-Star team 9 times, and in 1957 he won the Cy Young Award while leading the Braves to a World Series title. What set Spahn apart wasn't about eye-popping strikeout totals or unhittable peaks, it was the fact that he just never slowed down. His smooth left-handed delivery allowed him to pitch effectively deep into his mid-40s, and his command of a devastating screwball made him one of the toughest pitchers of his time. He's still the all-time leader in wins among left-handed pitchers with 363. The 1950s had no shortage of pitching stars though. Robin Roberts was the workhorse of the decade, leading the league in innings pitched. 5 straight years and logging over 300 innings 6 times. Whitey Ford was the Yankees ace with a 2.66 ERA and a sparkling postseason record. Though he missed 2 seasons to military service, early Wynn was a steady presence, racking up wins with both Cleveland and Chicago. Still, Spahn stands apart. Roberts had the volume, Ford had the postseason aura, but Spahn combined longevity, consistency, and championships. When you think of pitching in the 1950s, you think of Warren Spahn. 1960s, Sandy Koufax. One of the toughest choices in this video. From 1961 through 1966, Koufax put together a 6-year run that may never be matched. In that stretch, he won 3 Cy Young Awards, 63, 65, and 66, an MVP in 63, and led the Dodgers to 3 World Series titles. In those same years, he threw 4 no-hitters, including a perfect game in 65, and averaged over 280 strikeouts a season. Across the decade, Koufax pitched just over 1,800 innings, posted a 2.36 ERA and an ERA plus of 147, and racked up nearly 50 WAR in just 7 seasons. His 63 season was ridiculous. His 1963, 65, and 66 seasons were all ridiculous, where he had an ERA either right above 2 or well below. He also struck out a ridiculous amount of batters, as I mentioned. And in the postseason, he was untouchable. A career .95 ERA in the World Series with 4 shutouts. There were other legends in the 1960s though. Bob Gibson, who I was really close to choosing, was nearly Koufax's equal. Posted a 2.74 ERA and an ERA plus of 135 across the decade, and in 1968 he put up a 1.12 ERA that literally forced MLB to lower the mound. Juan Marichal quietly threw more innings than both them and finished the 1960s with over 190 wins. Young Tom Seaver debuted in 1967, winning Rookie of the Year and already setting himself up for the 1970s, but Koufax's peak was different. Gibson and Marichal were incredible for the whole decade, but Koufax's 6-year stretch is the kind of dominance that people still talk about 60 years later. Even with his career ending at just 30 due to arthritis, his brilliance in the 1960s defined pitching for an entire generation. I know a lot of people in the comments would probably pick Gibson and maybe even Marichal, and that's perfectly fine because this was a really tough choice and there's no one correct answer. Before I get to the 1970s, I just want to say if you're enjoying this video, be sure to subscribe and like, as it really helps me out. And also, when you're done with this, be sure to check out my best position player per decade video that I made a couple weeks ago. 1970s, Tom Seaver. If Koufax was the star of the 60s, then Tom Seaver was the ace of the 70s. Nicknamed Tom Terrific, Seaver combined power, control, and endurance in a way few pitchers ever have. From 1970 to 79, Seaver won 178 games, posted a 2.61 ERA, an ERA plus of 138, and threw over 2,600 innings. Struck out over 2,000 batters in the decade and racked up more than 80 WAR, the highest of any pitcher in the 70s. He won 3 Cy Young Awards, finished top 3 voting 2 other times, and made the All-Star team every year but one. Seaver's command was great and his fastball was overpowering, and he wasn't just padding stats on losing teams because he was the anchor of the 1969 Miracle Mets, leading them to one of the most improbable World Series titles in history, and then brought them back to the World Series in '73. The competition in the 70s was fierce. Steve Carlton had a case with a 3.18 ERA over 2,700 innings and a legendary 1972 season where he went 27-10 for the last place Phillies. Jim Palmer was the face of the Orioles dynasty, winning 3 Cy Youngs himself and anchoring multiple pennant winners. Nolan Ryan struck out more hitters than anyone else, tossing 4 no-hitters in the 70s alone, though his control issues held him back from Seaver's level. And Phil Niekro's knuckleball made him an Iron Man, logging over 2,800 innings in the decade. But Seaver had the best combination of it all: dominance, volume, hardware, and postseason legacy. 1980s, Dave Stieb. If you ask most fans who the best pitcher of the 80s was, you'll probably hear names like Roger Clemens or Dwight Gooden, but I don't think neither of them dominated the entire decade like Dave Stieb did. From 80 to 89, Stieb put up a 3.32 ERA, a 126 ERA plus, and threw over 2,300 innings, good for around 48 WAR, most of any pitcher in the decade. He was a workhorse, logging 265 or more innings 4 straight seasons, and consistently ranked among the league leaders in ERA. While he actually never won a Cy Young, he finished top 7 in voting 4 times and made 6 All-Star teams. Stieb also became famous for his near misses with no-hitters. Between 85 and 88, he lost 3 different no-hitters with 2 outs in the 9th inning. That string of heartbreak gave him a reputation for being snake-bitten, but it also showed how consistently dominant he could be. And while this wasn't in the 80s, he finally broke through with a no-hitter in 1990. Of course, the 1980s also gave us some of the brightest peaks in history. Dwight "Doc" Gooden exploded onto the scene in 1984, winning Rookie of the Year. Then in 85, put together one of the greatest pitching seasons ever. 24-4, a 1.53 ERA, and 268 strikeouts at age 20. But his dominance faded quickly. Roger Clemens debuted in 84, and by 86 had already won both the Cy Young and MVP, setting the stage for what would basically be a Hall of Fame career without getting into the Hall of Fame. Orel Hershiser set a record with 59 consecutive scoreless innings in 1988, and capped it with both the Cy Young and World Series MVP. But like Gooden, his absolute peak was relatively short. So while others had higher peaks, Stieb's case is that he was there all decade long. May not have had the same flash or the same postseason spotlight, but when you look at who actually led the 80s in value, it was Dave Stieb, the most consistent ace in a decade defined by inconsistency. 1990s, Greg Maddux. Unlike the 80s, the 90s were really a golden age for pitching. You had Randy Johnson blowing hitters away with a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, Pedro Martinez posting cartoonish ERA numbers in a steroid-fueled league, Roger Clemens reinventing himself for a second peak, and Tom Glavine quietly piling up wins. But the man who stood above them all was Greg Maddux. From 90 to 99, Maddux put together a run of efficiency and brilliance that almost defies belief. In the decade, he posted a 2.54 ERA, an ERA plus of 170, through nearly 2,400 innings, and racked up about 66 WAR. He struck out over 1,700 batters despite not being a power pitcher, and what made him so special was his command. Maddux could hit a dime-sized target on the corner of the plate, and he made some of the best hitters in the world to look helpless with his fastballs that barely even cracked 90. From 92 to 95, Maddux won 4 consecutive Cy Young Awards, something no one had ever done before. During that stretch, he averaged a 1.98 ERA and a 197 ERA plus, while throwing over 1,000 innings. In 94 and 95, his ERA plus was over 260, meaning he was over 2.5 times better than the league average. On top of that, he helped lead the Atlanta Braves to the 95 World Series. The competition, though, was fierce. Randy Johnson was a strikeout machine and was one of the most intimidating presences on the mound. Pedro Martinez might have been the most dominant per-inning pitcher in history by the end of the decade, including a 243 ERA plus in 1999. Roger Clemens won Cy Youngs with both Boston and Toronto, extending his career dominance, and Tom Glavine won 2 Cy Youngs himself and was the MVP of the 95 World Series. But Maddux separated himself by combining peak and consistency better than anyone else. Johnson had the strikeouts, Pedro had some incredible stats, Clemens had longevity, but Maddux had the complete package. He was the smartest pitcher of his time, maybe of all time, and in a decade full of legends, he was the one who truly defined pitching in the 1990s. He also is arguably the best fielding pitcher of all time. The 2000s began with Randy Johnson already in the middle of one of the most dominant stretches in pitching history. After finally putting it all together in Seattle in the 90s, the big unit took his game to another level in Arizona. From 2000 to 2002, Johnson won 3 straight Cy Young Awards. The streak was actually 4, dating back to 99. Led the league in ERA twice and in strikeouts every year. His 2001 season is legendary. He went 21-6 with 2.49 ERA and struck out 372 hitters, and then turned into a postseason monster. In the 2001 World Series, Johnson went 3-0 with a 1.04 ERA, pitching in relief in Game 7 on 0 days rest to help the Diamondbacks beat the Yankees. He and Curt Schilling shared World Series MVP honors, and it's still one of the greatest October performances ever. Across the decade, Johnson posted a 3.34 ERA, an ERA plus of 137, through nearly 1,900 innings, and piled up nearly 2,100 strikeouts. Even as he moved into his late 30s and early 40s, he was still a strikeout machine, with hitters completely helpless against his mix of 100-mile fastballs and devastating sliders. There were plenty of other greats in the 2000s. Yoan Santana was arguably the best from 2004 to 2008, winning 2 Cy Youngs, a pitching triple crown in 2006. Pedro Martinez was still dominant early on, winning the 2000 Cy Young with a 1.74 ERA and a 291 ERA plus that might be the greatest pitching season ever, at least in the modern era. Curt Schilling built his postseason legend with Arizona and Boston, adding another World Series ring in 2004, and Roy Halladay became the workhorse ace of the 2000s with over 2,000 innings and a Cy Young in 2003. But Johnson's combination of peak dominance, strikeouts, and postseason heroics made him the pitcher most associated with the 2000s. 2010s, Clayton Kershaw. If the 2000s were defined by Randy Johnson's intimidation, the 2010s were all about the brilliance and consistency of Clayton Kershaw. The Dodgers lefty not only dominated the decade, he might have been the single best regular season pitcher since the mound was lowered in 1969. From 2010 to 2019, Kershaw posted a 2.31 ERA, an ERA plus of 164, threw about 2,000 innings, and recorded about 60 WAR. He won 3 Cy Young Awards, led the league in ERA 5 times, and in 2014 he even won the NL MVP. That year he went 21-3 with a 1.77 ERA and threw a no-hitter with 15 strikeouts. It's just one of the most dominant single-season performances of all time. Kershaw's peak stretched for nearly the entire decade. From 2011 through 2017, he averaged a 2.1 ERA, struck out 9 batters per 9 innings, and rarely missed time. His curveball became one of the most iconic pitches of the modern era, and his ability to repeat elite seasons year after year set him apart. But the 2010s weren't just about Kershaw. Max Scherzer broke through as a strikeout king, winning 3 Cy Young Awards, throwing 2 no-hitters, and helped leading the Nationals to the 2019 World Series. Justin Verlander won 2 Cy Youngs in this decade and was MVP in 2011. He also reinvented himself later in the decade with Houston. Jacob deGrom may not have had as many innings, but his back-to-back Cy Youngs in 2018 and 2019 with a 1.7 ERA in 18 showed how overwhelming his peak was. And then, not as dominant in the regular season, Madison Bumgarner will always be remembered for his October dominance, especially in 2014. The postseason is the one knock on Kershaw. His playoff ERA in the 2010s sat over 4, and his struggles in October became a narrative that followed him for years. But when you step back and look at the full decade, no pitcher came close to matching his regular season dominance, consistency, and regular season hardware. And finally, we're at the 2020s. This may be a surprise since Zack Wheeler hasn't even won a Cy Young, and you have guys like Garrett Cole and Corbin Burns who have gotten these massive contracts. But then there's Zack Wheeler, who's been very underrated. In an era where pitchers get hurt very often, up until literally just around a month ago, Zack Wheeler had barely missed any starts in the 2020s, and has been a Cy Young runner-up twice. He has over 30 WAR in the decade, which leads MLB pitchers, and an ERA plus of 146 and over 1,000 strikeouts, and also helped the Phillies get to the World Series in 2022. With Wheeler missing the rest of the 2025 season and having thoracic outlet syndrome, we can only hope he recovers and finishing his career strong. Garrett Cole got the biggest contract for a pitcher in 2019 and has absolutely been worth it, winning a Cy Young in 2023. And before 2024, he never even went on the IL with the Yankees. He did miss half of 2024 and is missing the 2025 season while recovering from Tommy John. With a late career renaissance and a good recovery, he still can be the best pitcher of the decade. Corbin Burns is in the same boat as Cole, as he won a Cy Young as well and was a workhorse until this year. Tarek Skubal has been dominant for a couple of years now and arguably could win his second Cy Young. And of course there's Paul Skeens, who I think is the most likely candidate to be the pitcher of the decade when it's all said and done, as he's had one of the best starts to a career ever for a pitcher. And that's the video. You may not agree with all of these choices, even some of these I'm not 100% sure on, so I'd love to hear your reasonings in the comments. There's not a single one of these where there's one definitive answer, I don't think. You could make arguments depending on what stats you want to use, if you want to count postseason accolades more, but I would like to hear your opinions in the comments. And be sure to check out my video that I mentioned before where I went over the best position player in every decade. You can see that here in the end screen. And if you enjoy this, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and like this, as it really helps me out. Thank you for watching Baseball Domain, and I'll see you next time.